Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe right here on J&J Media Network, on Facebook Live, on Twitch TV, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Jonah Malkin, joining you every single Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Got a great show for you today. I'm super excited just for the entire sports landscape today. The NBA draft is taking place tonight. Where is LaMelo Ball going to go? I know his dad is kind of an oracle. It seems like nowadays he prognosticated that his son was going to be the number one overall pick in the draft this year. I'm curious to see if he goes first, where Anthony Edwards ends up being selected, what the Warriors are going to do. James Wiseman, there are a couple really interesting foreign players as well. So I'm looking forward to the NBA draft. I know there's going to be a lot of movement with that. Going to touch on the NBA trades that have just taken place because there's a lot of wild stuff happening in the NBA right now. The Vikings end their losing streak on Monday Night Football for Kirk Cousins. They beat the Bears. And then coming up around 8:35 or so, in about 35 minutes, NBC Sports' college football insider Ben Cross is going to join the show. So I'm excited for this. A lot to get into. Starting with the NBA, especially because the draft is taking place. A lot of fast things have been happening in NBA free agency with trades this offseason because it's a much shorter and truncated offseason. So you have to fit in all these trades. Again, the start of training camp starts beginning of December, which is in like 2 weeks. So you knew that a lot of trades were going to take place. And a couple days ago was the open hunting season in the NBA. So OKC trades Chris Paul to the Phoenix Suns. This is a big move for the Suns. This is a big move for the Suns. They trade Ricky Rubio, Kelly Oubre, Ty Jerome, Jalen Leck, and draft compensation to OKC. This is a great move for the Suns. First of all, you're reuniting Chris Paul with his head coach from the New Orleans Pelicans days in Monty Williams. Under Monty Williams, Chris Paul had the best statistical seasons of his career. In his fourth year and his fifth year, Chris Paul averaged 21 points a game, 11 and a half assists on 49% shooting. And in his fifth year, averaged 23 points a game, 6.5 assists on 50% shooting under head coach Monty Williams. They took the team to the playoffs. He was fantastic. And again, this is a Phoenix Suns team that won their final 8 games in the bubble. And again, I know that's not entirely indicative of how the regular season was going to unfold or how they would ultimately shake out in the entire competition and the entire landscape, because I understand that that's not entirely reflective of where the Phoenix Suns were throughout the entire season. The Phoenix Suns were 26-39 prior to the bubble. So in most people's eyes and in most people's estimations, that was pretty true to who they were. OKC, on the other hand, they finished 5th in the Western Conference, 44-28. OKC, Chris Paul's there, sure, great player. The surrounding cast is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, Steven Adams, and Luol Dort. That's your starting 5. Yes, you have Dennis Schroeder. I get it, and I love Dennis Schroeder now with the Lakers. Huge pickup for them. But the reality is no one expected OKC to, let alone make the playoffs, but also finish as a top 5 seed in the Western Conference. They finished ahead of the Mavericks, of Portland, nearly knocked off the Rockets in Game 7 of the first round, finished ahead of the Jazz. This is a team that had no expectations, and Chris Paul comes into the fold. He enters the fold and elevates them drastically. And now you're pairing him with the Phoenix Suns with a guy in Devin Booker who's just coming off a career year averaging 26.5 points per game on 48% shooting. The Suns, by the way, last year led the NBA in assists per game, if you can believe that. They led the NBA in assists per game with 27.2 assists per game. And now you're adding Chris Paul, who has averaged for his career 9.5 assists per game, into that fold. Devin Booker has always complained about being double teamed throughout his entire career. If you remember that viral video of him playing in an open gym a couple summers ago, and he was getting super frustrated and super upset because he's getting double teamed in these open gym games, in these open gym pickup games. And he's saying, come on, man, are you serious? We're not double teaming in the offseason. This ain't happening. I see double teams all year long in the NBA. Let's not do this. And of course, the unsung hero of that viral video is Joakim Noah, who's playing for the defense in that pickup game. And he's like, oh, yes, we are. Oh, yes, we are. And Devin Booker's just like, come on, man. Are we really doing this again? I get double teamed every single night in the NBA. In the pickup games, now I'm also double teamed in the offseason. Well, now you add a guy in Chris Paul. You can't double team Devin Booker nearly as frequently with which you could have in the past. And now you look at this starting lineup. Listen, you've got Devin Booker, you've got Chris Paul, you've got DeAndre Ayton. I'm not exactly sure who else is going to start, but Mikal Bridges, their pick from Villanova from last year, he's a 6'6", lanky, long defender who shot the three ball 36%. Then you got Cameron Johnson out of North Carolina, 6'8", shot the three-point ball at a 39% clip. Dario Saric, 6'10", that you received from the Philadelphia 76ers. He could start. He could come off the bench. This is a guy who can stretch the floor, shoots the ball at a 35% three-point clip. This is a good three-point shooting team, a team that shot at 35% from the three-point line last year. And now you're adding a guy in Chris Paul who not only can help facilitate the offense, but can be more of a threat. Because the problem is, yes, I understand statistically, Ricky Rubio had a fantastic season last year, especially from the three-point line. He shot at nearly 40% from the three-point line. But if you'd ask most GMs, if you ask most coaches, who do you want to leave wide open for a three-point shot? Ricky Rubio or Chris Paul? 10 out of 10 would say, let's leave Ricky Rubio open. No one in their right mind is going to say, yeah, let's just leave CP3 open at the top of the key. No one is ever going to say that. So now you're looking at guys like Cameron Johnson, Mikal Bridges, Devin Booker. These guys are going to get open looks. And DeAndre Ayton, who averaged 18 points, 11.5 rebounds last season, was one of the best big men in the NBA last year as a second-year player, missed most of the year with some violations and a suspension, but he's a monster. And you think about the kind of looks and the accountability, most importantly, that Chris Paul is going to hold him to. He's going to have to take ownership for his actions, and I think he's going to have a monster season. And you look at a guy in Chris Paul, again, 10-time All-Star. He's 35 years old. Everyone counted him out. Everyone said, well, his contract is overblown. Now you're starting to look at other people's contracts, and you're saying, well, actually, Russell Westbrook's contract is probably worse. John Wall's contract is probably worse. I think this can fit. And again, the Suns led the NBA in assists per game last season, which is hard to imagine. And the other piece of this is in the postseason. So last year, Paul averaged 17.5 points, 5 rebounds, 7 assists, 49% shooting. In the postseason, those numbers all spiked. 21 points per game. Increases in the assists, slight decrease in the rebounds. Shot at 51% from the floor. 37% from the three-point line as opposed to 36% in the regular season. So this is a guy who elevates his level of play in the postseason. And the other thing is we don't talk about in the NBA divisions anymore. In the NFL, all we hear about is what's the most difficult and toughest division in the NFL, what's the easiest. The easiest is easy to identify, the NFC East, right? The best team in the East has 3 wins, is the Eagles at a 3-5 record. right? But we never talk about the most difficult divisions and just divisions in general in basketball. Again, in the NFL, the NFC West is regarded fairly ubiquitously as the most difficult division in the NFL, with the Cardinals, Rams, and Seahawks all at 6-3 and the 49ers at 4-5. But in the NBA, no one talks about the divisions. The Pacific Division is brutal. Think about now who makes up the Pacific Division. You have the Lakers, you have the Clippers, you have the Warriors. Now you have the Phoenix Suns. The Warriors are healthy. The Phoenix Suns, again, more formidable now. And the Sacramento Kings aren't a joke. I don't know if they're a playoff team, probably not, but they're not a sleeper. You can't just roll out of bed and beat the Sacramento Kings, not with De'Aaron Fox, not with Buddy Hield. That's not a walk in the park. So this is a difficult division, but I think that with Chris Paul, this team can be somewhere between a 6th and an 8th seed. Because again, I think the Warriors are going to usurp some of those 4 and 5 seeds from last season. Obviously, I think OKC is going to drop a little bit. And the Rockets is kind of in a free fall. Obviously, if they hold on to Westbrook and Harden, they'll probably make it work and still make the postseason. But assuming that that whole situation kind of unfolds the way that we would expect and results in Rafael Stone and management trading Westbrook and Harden, you would imagine that the Rockets would take a step back. So now a couple teams have to enter the fold. So I actually think this is a big pickup for them. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he complements Devin Booker and this entire offense. And I love to see him reunited with Monty Williams. Monty Williams is a great coach, and I think he and Chris Paul are going to thrive and flourish together again. And transitioning to another team that I think can flourish after this trading offseason is the Milwaukee Bucks. I love this trade that the Milwaukee Bucks did. They traded for Drew Holiday. They got rid of Eric Bledsoe, Ersan Ilyasova, George Hill. So let's see. For Drew Holiday, the actual trade was for Eric Bledsoe, George Hill, 3 first-round picks, and 2 pick swaps. Bucks also traded for Bogdan Bogdanovic from the Kings, in essence for Dante DiVincenzo, Ersan Ilyasova, and DJ Wilson. I'm going to break down those trades. Let me first say this. David Griffin, tip of the cap to you for being able to demand and command so much for Drew Holiday. Think about this. The Lakers, to acquire Anthony Davis, a top 5 player in the NBA, gave up Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram, Josh Hart, 3 first-round picks, and the number 1 overall pick. Number 4, rather, overall pick in the NBA draft. That's to acquire a top 5 player in the NBA. David Griffin was able to orchestrate a trade for Drew Holiday, and he collected Eric Bledsoe, George Hill, 3 first-round picks, and 2 pick swaps. That is a massive haul for even a guy who I love in Drew Holiday. So major credit to the Pelicans. That is a tremendously well-crafted trade and a savvy move from a really, really intelligent and savvy GM. That was a tremendous haul to get for Drew Holiday. That's part 1. Part 2, I love this for the Bucks. Absolutely love this for the Bucks. It's a move that you had to do. Drew Holiday is a major upgrade from Eric Bledsoe. And I like Eric Bledsoe. I loved his days with the Clippers, loved his days with the Suns. And he's taken some steps forward. But you're looking at a guy in Drew Holiday who's been averaging for the last 3 seasons, when he's really kind of ascended, 20 points, 6.5 assists per game, 47% shooting, 2-time all-defensive team in 2018, first team all-defensive team, 2019 second team all-NBA defensive team. But this is a guy who delivers and performs in the fourth quarter and, most importantly, in the playoffs. This is why you have a guy like Drew Holiday on your team. This is why you do that. Because the bottom line is this. Now you look at this starting 5. I think that this fortifies their position as a top 2 team on paper and in general in the Eastern Conference. Them and the Nets have the two best rosters on paper. You look at the starting five for Milwaukee. Think about this. Now you have Drew Holiday, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Giannis, Chris Middleton, and Brook Lopez. That is a tremendous starting five. That starting five is a starting five lineup that can put up 95 points on any given night, maybe 100 points on a given night, potentially. These are all guys that can shoot. These are all guys that can score. Now, again, obviously, if the Nets acquire James Harden, which I'm going to touch on a little bit in about 10 minutes, that will change a little bit of my predictions. But for right now, I think Drew Holiday is fantastic. And I love Bogdan Bogdanovic, which I'm going to touch on as well. But the biggest difference, again, who do you like more, Drew Holiday or Eric Bledsoe? If you look at these two guys for their career over the last, again, not just 3 seasons, but you look at the postseason performances of a guy like Drew Holiday. The last time he was in the postseason was with Anthony Davis and the Pelicans, where they actually swept the Portland Trail Blazers in the first round, lost to the Golden State Warriors in the second round. Drew Holiday averaged 24 points per game, up 4 ticks from his previous season, 6 rebounds, 6 assists on 52% field goal percentage. I mean, this is a guy who elevates his game in the postseason from the regular season. In the regular season, he is a bubble all-star, and I love him. He's a UCLA guy. He's a defensive stalwart, and he's a leader. He's a point guard. And in the postseason, he's all of those attributes, but now he ascends to an actual all-star level and perhaps a number 2 player on a championship caliber team. That's what he elevates to. On the flip side, Eric Bledsoe, it's staggering the disparity between his production in the regular season and his production in the postseason. That's the biggest issue. That was the biggest issue with Eric Bledsoe. I loved the pace at which he could play. I love his change of momentum. I love his change of speed. I love his ability to create, but he's hit and miss. He's too inconsistent. He's too erratic with the basketball. He makes too many errant throws. And again, you look at the production in the regular season. Take a listen to this. In the regular season 2 years ago, in 2018, regular season Eric Bledsoe, 16 points a game, 5.5 assists, 4.6 rebounds, 48% from the floor, 33% from the three-point line. Not bad, very serviceable, especially as a number 3 in the regular season. In the postseason, in 2018, in the postseason, now his points per game drops to 13.7, 4 assists, under 4 rebounds per game, 41% field goal percentage, that's 7 percentage points lower, and an abysmal 24% from the three-point line, and I was rounding up for him in the postseason. In 2019, last season, averaged 15 points a game, 5 rebounds, again, 4.6 assists, 47% from the floor, 34% from the three-point line. In the postseason, those numbers dropped to 11.8 points per game, 25% from the three-point line, 39% from the floor. So his production has dropped off. And the reality is everyone wants to put the onus and the blame on Chris Middleton. The reality is Chris Middleton hasn't underperformed in the postseason. He is still giving you the same offensive production in the postseason as he was giving you in the regular season. Last year in the regular season, he averaged 20.3 points a game. Last year in the postseason, he averaged 20.3 points per game. The difference is he's just a little bit more inefficient in getting those buckets, in getting those points and scoring those baskets, but the actual point production is the same. And again, obviously you hope that the field goal percentage would increase or stay relatively the same in the postseason, but the reality is there isn't a drop-off in the actual production. With Bledsoe, there's actually a drop-off, a massive drop-off in the production. And so I think it's a huge upgrade for them. And now this is the trade that I think I love the most. Bogdan Bogdanovic, you trade for Dante DiVincenzo, Ersan Ilyasova, and DJ Wilson. Bogdan Bogdanovic is entering his 4th year in the league. He just wrapped up his third season in the league. He's averaging 15 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists. Shooting it an amazing 37% for his career from the three-point line. I don't want to embellish here, and I know people are going to freak out. He reminds me a lot of Ray Allen. I really do. Ray Allen is 6'5", shot a career 40% from the three-point line. He moved really well without the basketball. He could put the ball on the floor. He was athletic. He could hit the pull-up. Bogdan Bogdanovic is 6'6". Again, 37.4% three-point shooter for his career. He's athletic. He's versatile. He can hit the pull-up. He can hit a one-dribble pull-up. He can hit shots off the bounce. You can leave him open in the corner. He can spot up at the top of the key. Bogdan Bogdanovic, if he's your fourth scorer, you realize Bogdan Bogdanovic is going to be your fourth reliable scorer, averaging 15 points a game last year. He's unselfish. He moves great without the basketball. He reminds me a lot of Ray Allen. And the great thing is, if he's your fourth best option, that will do. That will do just fine. And he's a fantastic fit. Again, they've got a bevy of weapons now to choose from. Sure, their depth is hit a little bit. You still have Robin Lopez. You still have Pat Connaughton coming off the bench, and I'm sure they'll fill out the rest of the roster how they see fit. But I think that's a massive upgrade. Tommy Hickey, go Bucks. Shout out to Tommy. Lived on my freshman dorm floor in Celery. Appreciate you watching. I think the Bucks, again, I think that right now on paper, as it's currently constructed, they've got the best roster in the Eastern Conference. Now, is this enough to keep Giannis and to have Giannis stay? That I don't know. But what I do know is it's good enough, and it's a massive upgrade from last season for them to make a run in the Eastern Conference Finals, to advance out of the Eastern Conference Finals and into the finals. And at the end of the day, I think that to even have a chance of retaining Giannis, the Bucks have to at least advance to the finals at the very, very least. You have to make it out of the Eastern Conference to even make some kind of argument for him to stay. Now, let me transition to this. In the NBA, we've been talking about how it's been the year of duos, and now we're starting to see triple-headed monsters come together. And there were some rumblings about James Harden and the Rockets no longer really coexisting. Russell Westbrook wants out, and now James Harden kind of wants out of Houston as well. But apparently his destination that he's hoping for is the Brooklyn Nets. Now, let me first say this. Credit to James Harden for having the stones to turn down 2 years at $50 million guaranteed a year. He'd be the first person ever in a major athlete, in a major sport, to earn $50 million a year. And he turned that down. Massive stones for him to have the stones to do that. But the problem is, how does he fit with the Brooklyn Nets, right? Because the issue is going to be the usage rate. Harden has had the highest usage rate over the last 3 seasons. Last year, he was third in usage rate behind Luka Doncic and Giannis Antetokounmpo. But 2 years ago and 3 years ago, he was first in the league in usage rate. Okay, the problem is Kyrie Irving, I'm not going to count last year because he didn't even qualify. He missed over half of the games played with lingering shoulder injuries, so that doesn't count. But 2 years ago, Kyrie Irving was 9th in the NBA in usage rate. 3 years ago, he was 16th. Last year, James Harden averaged 20 shots a game on 34 points per game, 7 rebounds, 6 assists. Kyrie Irving averaged 21 shots a game. Kyrie Irving averaged more shots a game than James Harden last year. That's going to be the biggest issue, is how are those two guys going to mesh and coexist? I have no qualms. I have no concerns about Kevin Durant. He's going to be fine. He averages 27 points per game for his career. He's going to be fine. The question is, how is James Harden and Kyrie Irving going to coexist? And the Rockets, understandably, are in no rush whatsoever to trade him. And why should they be? He's signed under contract for the next 2 seasons, for this 2020-2021 season, and then the 2021-2022 season. They have no obligation to trade him or Westbrook. And there are a lot of people within that organization that are saying they're just going to try and run it back unless they receive a massive haul akin to the kind of deal in terms of assets collected that the Pelicans received for Drew Holiday. Unless you get that similar type of haul and then some for a James Harden or a Russell Westbrook, they're not going to entertain trades. And they don't have to. Both of those guys are signed through to 2022. So, but the problem is also this. Again, how is the chemistry going to work? There's only one basketball. How is this going to work? Kevin Durant's going to fit seamlessly. Apparently, Kyrie Irving wasn't thrilled about James Harden potentially joining the team. I understand that, because now who's going to be third fiddle? Well, it's going to be Kyrie Irving, most likely. That's just the reality. But on the flip side, I mean, this team unequivocally will have the most talent in the Eastern Conference and maybe in the NBA if James Harden joins their squad. There's no question about it. And so by virtue of the simple fact that you're putting together 2 former MVPs and a guy in Kyrie Irving who is a hair underneath an MVP caliber player, they can't be that bad, is the bottom line. You're not going to see them falter, because you can't. You physically can't falter to such a degree when you've got 3 quality players like that. They finished 7th in the Eastern Conference last year. The fact that they even made the playoffs last year was remarkable. Seeing them go up against the Raptors in the first round with Karis LeVert doing his thing. Spencer Dinwiddie didn't even show up. DeAndre Jordan didn't even show up. I love Joe Harris. I hope that for their sake they can re-sign him. But again, if you're going to acquire James Harden, plus not to mention, I don't even think the Rockets should do that trade, because I don't think Spencer Dinwiddie, a package surrounding Dinwiddie and LeVert, is enough to justify sending a guy like James Harden, who's the best player to ever play for your franchise. Apologies to Akeem Olajuwon. Maybe some people think he's better, but I think it's James Harden. But regardless, that is going to be an amalgamation right there. I can't imagine how that's going to unfold if that happens. I will say this, the ratings will be off the charts if that happens. The ratings will be absolutely sky high for the Nets and for the NBA if that happens. Morning, Joe. Right here on J&J Media Network, on Facebook Live, Twitch TV, Twitter, and on YouTube with yours truly, Jonah Malkin, Mondays and Wednesday mornings, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Coming up in around 10 minutes, my college football insider from NBC Sports, Ben Cross, is going to join me very shortly. But first, couple NFL topics I want to talk about. I think that people always forget about these Monday Night Football games, and specifically Kirk Cousins and his record on Monday Night Football, because prior to Monday, Kirk Cousins was 0-9 as a starter on Monday Night Football. Hard to imagine, maybe, kind of is, given the types of teams that he's been on. He finally ends that drought of his, I guess, ineptitude and inability to win on a Monday Night Football game. So credit to them, credit to him that he ended that streak. Vikings have now won 3 games in a row. But here's the key takeaway for me. First of all, this season's going to end up the same for the Vikings. I'm going to touch on their schedule. They had one of the most difficult schedules right out of the gates, losing 4 of their first 5. I expect them to close the season going 5-2. I'll break that down in just a minute. But here's the key takeaway for me. The Vikings have found their next number 2, number 1 wide receiver. This kid, Justin Jefferson, listen, I'm not saying he's Stephon Diggs. I know he's not. But if you think that there's a major drop-off between Justin Jefferson and Stephon Diggs, you are sadly mistaken. He had 8 catches, 135 yards against a Bears secondary. This isn't just a bad defense. This is a good defense. Tayshaun Gibson Jr., this is a really good Bears secondary. And you're looking at a guy in Justin Jefferson who's got the 4th most receiving yards in the NFL as a rookie, as a true rookie. This kid, Justin Jefferson, I remember him playing at LSU. I mean, think about this. At LSU, he had 111 catches on the season, over 1,500 yards. His last 2 games in the playoffs for the Tigers last season. And again, I know that offense was historically great. I know Joe Burrow was historically great. So initially you want to attribute the success to the quarterback. But conversely, against Oklahoma, 14 catches, 227 yards receiving, 4 touchdowns in a national semifinal. And in the national championship game against Clemson, he had over 100. He had 106 yards receiving. Justin Jefferson, this is the big takeaway. This was the 4th game in the NFL where he's had over 100 yards receiving. 166 versus Atlanta, 103 versus Houston. I get it. Those 2 aren't great. 175 receiving yards versus the Tennessee Titans. You want to tell me the Tennessee Titans defense isn't good? Malcolm Butler isn't a good defensive back? I understand up front the Titans aren't the best. Their secondary is still good. So, I mean, Justin Jefferson, that's the big takeaway. Now, I slightly misspoke. I said he's 4th in receiving yards. He's 7th in receiving yards. He's 4th in yards per catch. 4th in yards per catch. 18 yards per catch for a rookie in Justin Jefferson. And again, you got to follow LSU as well because Jamar Chase, who opted out of the season, he will likely be the best wide receiver taken in this NFL draft. I know Devontae Smith and I know that he's going to have something to say about that as well. But, I mean, Jamar Chase is going to be a force to be reckoned with. So now the key of the game, though, again, the Bears, Cordero Patterson runs back the kickoff to start the second half, takes it 104 yards. Vikings offense held to a 3-and-out. They got to punt the ball. Bears receive the ball, and on that punt, this is the key play. On that punt, they muff it. Their punt returner runs into their own special teams guy. Vikings scoop it up in the red zone. And then, of course, the Vikings have to settle for a field goal, which is so Vikings-esque. And then the final touchdown for the Vikings, of course, they have a botched extra point attempt. They can't even get off a kick. They've got to scramble on a busted play to try and throw the ball into the end zone. Pretty much summed up the Vikings in a nutshell. But again, they had the hardest schedule right out of the gates. I mean, their first 5 games versus the Packers was a loss. At the Colts was a loss. Versus the Titans was a loss. At Texans was a win. And then at the Seahawks was a loss. The only bad loss for them during that stretch was versus the Falcons, who ended their 5-game losing streak by beating the Vikings. That was their only bad loss. The other losses are against quality teams, are against winning teams atop their divisions and atop their conferences. And their remaining schedule, they've got versus the Cowboys, versus the Panthers, versus the Jaguars, at the Bucks, versus the Bears, and at the Saints. Now, I think that they can go 5-2. I think they'll beat the Cowboys, beat the Panthers, and beat the Jaguars. At the Bucks will probably be a loss. Versus the Bears, again, I think that they can win that game. At the Saints is interesting. It's probably a loss, but then again, we don't know what the health status of Drew Brees is. I'm not sure if he's going to be playing. I'm not sure if he's going to be back. We saw the Vikings beat the Saints in the postseason in the wild card game last year. That was Kirk Cousins' first postseason win. So not sure how that's going to unfold. So I think the Vikings have to close out 5-2. Ideally, they'd have to go. They probably need to go 6-1 and need to split either that Bucks or Saints game and go 1-1 in those to have a chance at making the postseason. And then the Bears have just unraveled since that game against the Rams. They've lost 4 straight. I'm sorry for Nick Foles that he had to have taken that kind of punishment, especially late in the game like that. You never want to see that, but Bears have unraveled. Vikings still have a chance, but again, the key takeaway for me is Justin Jefferson. This kid is fantastic. All right, final thing, and by the way, Drew Brees, I hope that he recovers well. Suffered a collapsed lung and rib fractures to both sides of his ribs. Expected to miss optimistically 2 to 3 weeks. It's probably going to be more than that. Fortunately for the Saints, their next 4 games are easily winnable games. They play the Falcons twice. They play the Eagles and at the Broncos. So I think Jameis Winston can win those games or most of those games. But we'll see what happens. All right, final topic. Before Ben Cross joins me, it's my mid-season NFL awards. Going to give you my most surprising team from the AFC and the NFC, starting with the AFC. It's Las Vegas Raiders. It's the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm sorry. I was close to selecting the Dolphins, but the bottom line is we knew that Brian Flores was a good coach. Maybe we didn't expect him to elevate the Dolphins this quickly, but we knew that the Dolphins were heading in the right direction. But the Raiders, there were so many question marks, so much uncertainty surrounding John Gruden. Is he really a good coach? Could he elevate this organization? And the reality is, to his credit, they were 4-12 in year 1, 7-9 in year 2, and now they're 6-3, top 5 record in the AFC. So he's been coaching players extremely hard. He's changed the culture. This group is tenacious defensively. They're gritty. They're tough-minded. They've pulled out some gutsy wins this past season. Obviously, they have another huge test against the Chiefs this weekend, but they've beaten the Chiefs already this year on the road. And the reality is he's imbued in his players a sense of confidence. And right now, just like he had preached in Hard Knocks in his first run as a head coach, his team is shattering people's dreams and filling them with nightmares instead. Derek Carr is playing extremely well this year, over 2,100 yards, 16 touchdowns, just 2 interceptions. 2 interceptions is second fewest in the NFL. He's got a top 10 QBR, 75.5. Josh Jacobs is elevating himself to perhaps one of the best running backs in the NFL, maybe the best running back in the AFC. I know Derrick Henry has something to say about that. I know Nick Chubb makes a good argument, but Josh Jacobs right now, 700 rushing yards. That's top 4 in the NFL, second most attempts. This is a guy who's scored 8 touchdowns. Josh Jacobs is legitimate. And then you got Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow, Henry Ruggs. The Raiders got some speeders. I mean, they've got some really good players. Nelson Aguilar, who they got from the Eagles, and then their defense, LaMarcus Joyner, Jonathan Abram. And this defensive end, Max Crosby, 6 sacks this season. So the defense is getting after it. I've been really impressed with the Raiders from the AFC. I don't think anyone saw this coming at 6-3 right now, and they are firmly in the playoffs right now. And then on the flip side, the same thing could be said about the Arizona Cardinals. I understand they got lucky against the Bills. Even had they lost that game, I still think that we would be looking at this team and saying, what a major success this is. What a major success story this season has been. They're 6-3, tied for the 4th best record in the NFC, tied for the best record in the toughest division in the NFL, the NFC West. Cardinals, Rams, Seahawks, all tied at 6-3. The 49ers are 4-5. Or 4-6 rather. And Kyler Murray he's not the MVP, no question, but he has entered his name into that conversation. 2,375 yards, He's thrown too many interceptions, 17 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, but this guy is leading and engineering drives like we haven't seen with his legs. They've got the best offense in the league, best rushing attack in the league. DeAndre Hopkins, that trade has been fantastic. He's second in the league in receiving yards with over 800, second in catches this year. The Cardinals took a chance. They took a chance on a first-year head coach with no NFL coaching experience in Cliff Kingsbury, a guy who was a head coach at Texas Tech and had a losing record over 5 seasons. They took a chance on him. They took a chance selecting Murray with the first overall pick in the draft, and they took a chance making a trade for DeAndre Hopkins, and all of these moves have paid off hugely and have come to fruition for this team, and they're thriving right now. And I don't think anyone could have seen. Yes, people thought they were going to be competitive, but they were 5-11 last year. Now they're 6-3. So much credit to them. And it's been exciting to see them. So the Raiders from the AFC and the Arizona Cardinals from the NFC. Okay. Now joining me from NBC Sports, college football insider, content curator and distributor, Ben Cross joins the show. Ben, thank you so much for joining me. Okay, so let's start with this, Ben. AP Top 10 came out. All right, now I know the official Top 10 is coming out next week as far as the committee's first reveal of the Top 10. Right now, the Top 10 is Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Clemson, Texas A&M, Florida, Cincinnati, BYU, Indiana, and Wisconsin at 10. Here's what I think is the top 10. These are my top 10 picks. I've got Alabama at 1. No question with that. I have Ohio State at 2 over Notre Dame. I have Notre Dame at 3. You can quibble with that, but I have Ohio State ahead of Notre Dame. I got Clemson at 4. Right now, I've got Texas A&M at 5, Florida at 6, just because Texas A&M beat them. But I have to be honest. If they were to play again this week, I'm not sure if I would stay true to that. Florida, their offense with Kyle Trask, 28 touchdowns in 6 games. I could flop on that. Then here's where I have a little bit of an issue. I actually have Indiana at 7. I have Wisconsin at 8. I have Cincinnati at 9, and I have BYU at 10. Let me ask you, first of all, setting aside my own top 10. What do you make of the current top 10 according to the AP poll? And would you have any changes with that?
To be honest, I don't have much of an issue with the top 10 at all right now. I understand where you're coming from with your arguments. I think we have to look at this from the perspective of who's played the games and how well have they looked in those games. I don't think Ohio State should be ahead of Notre Dame. I really don't. I think you look at Ohio State, and sure, they've played well and they've looked like a great team, but they haven't looked like earth-shatteringly good, and they haven't also played more than 3 games. I think you look at Notre Dame, they not only have the best win in the country against Clemson, granted without Trevor Lawrence, but it was still a gritty win against a top 5 team, something that Ohio State doesn't have. And they've played, 8 games? So I think Notre Dame absolutely deserves to be number 2, Bama absolutely number 1. I think you can put Ohio State at 3. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Clemson as they continue to play games. I agree with A&M and Florida. I think that's an interesting discussion. I agree that Florida is probably a better team, but I'm a firm believer if you play head-to-head and have the same record, the winner of that head-to-head has to get the credit in that situation. So I definitely think A&M should remain ahead of Florida until proven that they really don't deserve that spot. Beyond that, I understand the thought to put Indiana and Wisconsin ahead of BYU and Cincinnati. I could understand if you wanted to put Indiana ahead of BYU in that Indiana has played some tougher teams and is, playing a stiffer competition that BYU hasn't played any ranked teams. But Cincinnati has played some legitimate teams, and they've looked incredibly dominant. I think Cincinnati absolutely should be in the playoff conversation for that 4th slot. It'll be interesting to see where the committee puts them next Tuesday. But I think Cincinnati and BYU need to be ahead of at least Wisconsin. I would understand if Indiana was ahead of BYU and behind Cincinnati. But I think if you look at the top 10 right now, I think it makes a ton of sense. I'm very curious to see how the playoff committee addresses the Big Ten in those 3 Big Ten teams. Obviously, Indiana and Ohio State will play each other, so one of those teams will fall back. But I'm very curious, given that none of those three teams have played more than 4 games. Ohio State's played 3 and Wisconsin's only played 2. I think the amount of games that you've played absolutely should factor into it. And if you have a disproportionate amount of games that you've played more than another team, you should get credit for that. Not that it's the Big Ten's fault, but I think at the end of the day, there's just more film out there. And if you continue to be dominant at the same rate over those games, you absolutely should get more credit for that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about Cincinnati in a couple minutes because I do want to talk about them. Definitely don't want to take any credit for the away from them. So let's stick with the Big Ten, though. First of all, I know that you had to have been ecstatic and elated, just like I was watching that thrashing that Wisconsin displayed over Michigan, beating them 49-11, handing them their second worst home loss since 1967. If I get this correctly, yeah, since So Michigan suffered its largest home loss since 1935 to Ohio State, 38-0. Wisconsin matched that margin of victory, which I know we were both really elated to see. And now Michigan falls to 1-3 for the first time since like 1928, which is, the only season they had a worse 4-game stretch was 1928. So I know we were both happy about that. It's only the second game that they've played. And granted, some of it was self-induced given the fact that COVID penetrated their locker room. But in those 2 games and against Michigan, how impressed were you with what you saw from this Wisconsin team, especially against Michigan on Saturday night?
Very, very impressed. I mean, you look at the starters that they had out for that game, and they were in significant spots. It wasn't as if they were missing a few second stringers. There were several starters on their defense and a few on their offense that they missed against Michigan. And Michigan isn't a terrible team. I think you do have to now lump them in that tier with Penn State and Nebraska this year, where it's just confusing how bad these teams are, considering how good they normally are in their history of success. But they're still not a team that I think it's just expected that you roll over them, especially coming off of 2 weeks with no games. But beyond that, they also weren't in the facility. They weren't practicing. They didn't have all their starters out there. They didn't have the normal connection. I mean, Graham Mertz returned with 2 days before he had to go on the road to play against Michigan, as this is his first year starting anyway. The job that they did, and it's not as if Mertz played as if he did against Illinois in week 1, but that offense was efficient. The defense was incredible. I think Wisconsin has been unblemished to this point. I know they've allowed some points, but I think if you look at those games, they thoroughly dominated them. They didn't have to try in the second half of either of those games, and they still look good. The test obviously comes this weekend against Northwestern, a team that has proven that they're legitimate and can play against a team in Wisconsin. And I think an interesting stat that I've seen this week surrounding that game, Northwestern has won 5 of its last 6 at home against Wisconsin. Certainly an interesting stat. Pat Fitzgerald loves to coach against Chris. They're always head-to-head, very brutal battles, and it's going to be interesting to see, how Wisconsin plays against a team that we know is legitimate. Michigan, it was a little up in the air whether they could come back and win a game against a top 15 team and put themselves at least into a legitimate conversation. Illinois, not quite there yet, but it should be interesting. Wisconsin Northwestern, I think it's going to be a test for both teams.
So the interesting thing about that matchup, and again, that's a great stat that you bring up, and I think stylistically, I'm not going to say they entirely mirror one another, but their programs are built similarly. Their defenses are both elite. Wisconsin, first best in opponent scoring points per game. Northwestern is 7th best. They both defend the run really well, and that was, I think, the difference and will be the difference in this matchup this year. In years past, Northwestern could load up the box, try and contain the Jonathan Taylors, the Monty Balls, the Corey Clements, right? The Melvin Gordons. Now, Wisconsin finally has a guy who's the ultimate trump card, who's the X factor, a quarterback in Graham Mertz who's not viewed as a liability or just mediocre. Opponents don't want to make Graham Mertz beat them. Yes, he doesn't have the kind of experience yet. He only has 2 games under his belt. But from what he's shown, you have to imagine that Pat Fitzgerald is not thinking, yeah, let's just let Graham Mertz have time to throw like as if he was planning against Jack Cohn. or Alex Hornibrook. Like, no, you don't want to give Graham Mertz that amount of time. To me, he's the ultimate trump card. Wisconsin's number 10, Northwestern's number 19, assuming that both of these teams can continue to finish out the completion of their regular season games. This is really going to define the Big Ten West. Which team is going to play? Most likely Ohio State, although Indiana might have something to say about that, and I'll ask you about that in a second. I mean, how do you envision this game shaping out? Again, Wisconsin has had their troubles and have had their struggles on the road in Evanston. But then again, I don't think they've had a quarterback since Russell Wilson that they do right now in Graham Mertz, who the game plan, I think, first and foremost, has to be to try and contain him as opposed to stopping the run.
Well, you mentioned in years past how Northwestern would stack the box and stop the run. I still think they're going to do that. I mean, you look at Wisconsin against Illinois, the run game just wasn't there. Then they came out against Michigan with a completely different game plan, and they ran it all over Michigan. Northwestern's not a team you can run against, but Paul Chryst really likes to get creative with play calling, and you saw that last week against Michigan. I don't know how many end arounds he ended up giving to Danny Davis. I think it was 5 or 6 to him specifically. He loves designing those type of runs against teams that don't do well in space. Northwestern is a great tackling team, and Mertz is going to have to step up. I think the interesting thing is going to be, can Mertz at least play how he did against Illinois? If he can do that, I think Wisconsin controls this game. I think they control time possession. As you've said, he adds a different factor to this offense. If he plays how we know he can play, he only really has one legitimate game of tape against Michigan. He didn't have to do anything, and he didn't honestly play that great of a game. So it's going to be interesting against a legitimate defense that tackles well and is going to force third and longs, third and manageables. He's going to have to be efficient on those downs and get them down the field. I think Wisconsin definitely has the advantage. I think they play a similar style of football. They just play it a little bit better. They just have to not turn the ball over as they have in previous years in Evanston and finish drives. If they get held to a bunch of field goals, I fully expect Northwestern to be able to hold home court and potentially win this game.
Well, the good thing is Wisconsin's one of the best teams in the red zone offensively this year. But it is funny. I laugh at all these end arounds. At some point, the opposing coaches are going to say to themselves, Ben, okay, can they do anything else on a 3rd and 7 or 2nd and 10? Because that I watched that happen. And again, normally the only team that they can't do that against is Ohio State, because they try and run it in the Big Ten championship games and they get stuffed. But it's amazing to me how often, and we've been saying this for the last, I don't know how many years, since Paul Chryst and Jim Leonard have been the combination there. Wow, they're running an end around again. It's another misdirection, and it works.
Paul will run it if it works. Yeah, that is the one thing he has been confident in. If a play is working, he will run it 10 times against you.
And in fairness, the timing in which he decides to employ that, it ends up working great. Okay, so I touched on Indiana. So now this is the big matchup for Indiana, ranked in the top 10 for the first time in God knows how many years. They've lost their last 25 games, Ben, to Ohio State. They haven't beaten Ohio State in 25 tries. And now they're going to the shoe, number 3 Ohio State. I really like Michael Penix Jr. I think he has played really well, especially the last 2 games. I know he threw 2 interceptions in his last outing against Michigan State, but he's thrown for back-to-back over 300 yards in his last 2 games. And I think he just provides an additional element of elusiveness that they didn't have before at that quarterback position. Tom Allen has those guys playing well. And then Ty Freifogel, this wide receiver, has come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you're looking at the headlines on ESPN or on The Athletic and all these different sites, and it's, Ty Freifogel had another 100-plus yard game. He had 200 yards receiving against Michigan State in the shutout. He had over 140 yards against Michigan the week prior. What kind of chance are you giving the Hoosiers to perhaps upset Ohio State or at least make this a very competitive game?
Well, it's certainly not impossible. I think if they're opportunistic and are able to win the turnover margin, they have a chance. But there's a reason that there's a 20.5 point spread on this game. And I think it's because, as you were talking about, Indiana has been elevated by certain players on their offense and a few players on their defense this season, as opposed to being an entire unit that has just risen up. I give a ton of credit to Tom Allen. I think he's got to be, at least for right now, the front runner for Coach of the Year, not just Big Ten Coach of the Year. But I think you look at this matchup, and Ohio State is going to be able to shut down Penix to less than 300 yards and certainly not going to allow a receiver to go over 200 yards. And in the absence of those two players dominating, who else is Penix going to be able to throw it to? Is the run game going to be able to work against Ohio State's defensive line and front seven? And I think the answer is no. I think Ohio State won't necessarily blow the door hinges off, but I do think that they will dominate in this game. And as good as Indiana has been, they haven't really played all that many good teams. I know that's tough to say. They've looked convincing in a lot of their wins, but they scraped by a Penn State team that has turned out to be pretty awful. And then a few of their other games, beating Rutgers and Michigan State, it's not necessarily convincing that they're going to be able to topple Ohio State. I don't think it's impossible. I appreciate everything that they've done, and they certainly look like they're heading in the right direction. But to say that they're going to beat Ohio State, especially on the road in the shoe, I know there's no fans, but regardless, traveling to the shoe is a big deal, and it's an intimidation factor. And I think Ohio State's going to be ready to play, especially considering Ohio State sat out this last week because Maryland had some COVID cases. That's basically a bye week for Ohio State. A well-rested Ohio State coming against an Indiana team that hasn't really played a legitimate team yet, or hasn't played a tough team yet, I think is a recipe for an Ohio State win, at least by 10 points. It could be a close game, but I think at the end, Ohio State will pull it out.
So, final two questions. I think that Notre Dame beating Clemson in double overtime in South Bend a couple weeks ago was the worst possible scenario. It ended up providing the worst scenario, I think, to four teams. To the non-Power 5 teams, especially with Cincinnati and BYU. I also think it really, really hurt and threw a wrench in Oregon's potential chances to represent the Pac-12, and even to a lesser degree, a team like a Texas A&M, whose only loss came to Alabama and is not going to get that extra chance to showcase their talent. And I think the problem now is with Notre Dame winning, if they can keep Clemson to a competitive, tight game in the ACC championship game, I think that even if they lose that game, they'll still be inserted into that fourth and final spot because they beat them already. Now, if Clemson blows them out, maybe the committee says, well, you know what? Then that was a fluke game in South Bend. You have a starting quarterback, a true freshman quarterback in DJ Uyunglele for the first time. So I think that win for Notre Dame really threw a wrench specifically in the chances of those non-Power 5 teams. And we talked about Cincinnati. Listen, they definitely have had a legitimate schedule. They've beaten a ranked Army team. They've beaten UCF already. They've beaten Memphis. They've beaten Houston. They beat, I think, another ranked team earlier in the year, a ranked SMU team. And they get UCF right now, the number one passing attack in the NCAA. And the remaining schedule is still, there's still a couple good teams left. They have a ranked Tulsa at the end of the year. They've got some opportunities. And I love the job that Luke Fickell has done, you know, coming from Ohio State with his defensive background and elevating Cincinnati. But with Notre Dame beating Clemson now and really leaving the margin for error razor thin, and I almost think to a degree taking the element of controlling your own destiny out of the hands of Cincinnati, do you see any scenario in which the way that this current situation is, Cincinnati perhaps making the playoff?
There are certain situations, but as you said, the control has been taken away from them, which is very unfortunate for a very solid team. I wouldn't necessarily say that Notre Dame is out of the woods just yet. They actually have some competitive games coming up. Wake Forest, they play North Carolina next week, and then they'll have to play Clemson again. It'll be very interesting. There's still a chance Notre Dame could beat Clemson in the ACC championship and eliminate the Tigers. I don't necessarily see that happening. I think there's still a chance that Notre Dame could lose one of these last few games, They have not been immune to close games. They have played a few of those. They were able to escape Boston College this past week and play a relatively dominant game. They seem to be coming into form, but they've got some tough teams coming up, teams that can really score points. And if they can hang with them in shootouts, I'm not necessarily thinking that Notre Dame doesn't have a chance to lose to any of those teams before they would have a rematch against Clemson. So there are some scenarios. Obviously, if you're Cincinnati, you want to win out and then just see what happens. I think Cincinnati is a much better chance than BYU to make the playoff. But it certainly was a difficult scenario for Notre Dame to win that game and give Clemson an opportunity to win the rematch, and then both those teams go.
And I feel a little badly for Zach Wilson. I think he's having a fantastic season at BYU, definitely firmly in the Heisman conversation. Second most passing yards in the NCAA. He's been fantastic. Okay, final question, and then I'm going to let you go. Are you more depressed or happy that your Dallas Cowboys still actually have a chance at winning this division? Because it doesn't seem like anyone wants to win the NFC East, and the best team right now looks like the New York Giants.
Well, depending on the way you look at it, it can be a blessed situation for any one of those teams because you can battle for a top 5 pick at the same time that you're battling for a division title. One way or the other, you're going to get something that's not too terrible. I think you look at the Dallas Cowboys right now, they looked solid against the Steelers, and they didn't necessarily get blown out by the Eagles. They technically still have a chance with Gilbert in the lineup, and also Dalton could come back into the fold, where they can try out some of these quarterbacks and see what the situation is and then assess in the offseason whether Dak is the guy that they want to go to before they enter the NFL draft this upcoming April or May. So it's going to be interesting for the Cowboys specifically, but the NFC East as a whole, I don't know who's going to win. I mean, the Giants come off an impressive win, and you've got Washington still in the mix with Alex Smith as the starting quarterback. The Cowboys start to look better and lose a close game against the Steelers. I think any one of these teams could win it. To be honest, I might think that the Giants could be favored to now somehow win this division the way that they looked this past week against the Eagles. But there's a lot up in the air, and I think as a Cowboys fan, I'm looking at it from the perspective of I don't need to win this division. Hosting a playoff game is all fine and good, but no one
could host a playoff game potentially. Absolutely. With a 5-11 record, the Dallas Cowboys could host a playoff game with a chance to make it to the divisional round.
It would be history. It would certainly be interesting, but no NFC East team is winning a game in the playoffs this year. I would, wager quite a bit on that. But regardless, I think you look at it and you say you have to change a lot of things in the offseason. Even if you win the division, there are a lot of problems with your team that you have to fix. I think Mike Nolan needs to go as defensive coordinator, and I think Mike McCarthy needs to change some things about how he's approaching play calling and the offense, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when Dak comes back. But also, they've got a lot of problems in the secondary that they need to address. Their offensive line is beat to hell. It's going to be interesting with the Cowboys, but every team in the NFC East has issues that they'll need to work on, even though at the end of the year, one of them will technically be crowned division champion and sent to the playoffs. They have to do that. It's a formality. But at the end of the day, it's an interesting position to be in. I guess I'm more at the point where I'm just observing the rest of the NFL and enjoying the stress-free Sundays, knowing that if my team loses, I'm just as happy as I was a week prior.
Always good stuff from Ben. I'm going to continue to check in with you, by the way, about the Cowboys, of course, and college football. Ben Cross, NBC Sports' college football insider and content curator and distributor. Thank you so much for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
Always great to have Ben Cross with me. Final topic of the day, Malkin's Moments. I love this segment. My favorite segment from the week, my favorite moments from the past week. I've got a number of them. First of all, we got to give a shout out in the MLB to the Atlanta Braves, Freddie Freeman, first baseman, for winning the NL MVP for the first time since Chipper Jones did it in 1999. That's the first Braves player to win the NL MVP, so shout out to him. Then in the on the flip side, the Chicago White Sox, Jose Abreu, 317 batting average, 60 RBIs, 19 home runs in 60 games, helped the White Sox return to the playoffs for the first time in several years. And then finally, this isn't even a sports-related thing. So 4 astronauts launched into orbit into the first fully operational flight to the space station by SpaceX's new passenger spacecraft. That's Elon Musk's space company, exploration company. that is major news. I love to hear those kinds of stories. I love to hear the evolution and the development in our technology. So that's Malkin's Moments for you. Wow. What a packed show. What a great show. This has been a fast week. Excited for the NBA draft. Again, hashtag JMalk, hashtag Morning Joe. Like, follow, subscribe, shout out your favorite cup of Morning Joe. I'll give you a shout out back. Thank you so much for joining me. You've been watching Morning Joe right here on J&J Media Network on Facebook Live, Twitch TV, Twitter, and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. And as always, have a lovely rest of your morning.